morning, everyone. This is fantastic. Good morning, Connecticut. All right, so this morning, this is our first workshop. Thank you so much for coming to Political Intelligence here. We know that our Quiet Corner Democrats are not quiet. We are excited. We're ready to work, roll up our sleeves. And you know, as a team, we can get anything done. So today we're going to talk about our first workshop is unsuppressing the vote. And this is, becoming more and more important as more and more of us get informed and be able to fight the good fight and take it to our friends and neighbors and explain what people need to learn. It's not as intuitive as we think it is. And so this morning we are so fortunate to have two amazing speakers. Little housekeeping. So Joe Carvalho told me that if we get Zoom bombed, if somebody comes up and it's not right, we're all going to go dark and we're all going to go mute while he fixes it. So if that happens, don't jump off the call, just stick with me. At quarter of, I'm going to gently give the hook. At 10 of, I'm going to be a little bit more firm. And we are out at 5 of so that you can get a drink, go to the bathroom, and log on to your next call. All right? So thank you all for coming. You are all amazing Americans. I'm so honored to be here with you. So with no further ado, we have State Representative Mike Winkler from Vernon, who will be presenting. I did a quick Google search to make sure I got the date right. And I'm like, really? He only got elected in 2017 was his first session, but he's been around a really long time, a good friend of ours for a really long time. So thank you, Mike. And we also have Dr. Carol Rizzolo, who is going to talk and teach us about the coordinated effort, which is actually federal on the Center for Common Ground, as well as some other really amazing initiatives. So with no further ado, I will hand over the mic to Mike.
Thank you. So, have you all seen this? You're muted, so don't worry about it. But read it for a second. So Connecticut has some of the most restrictive voting laws in the country. And the reason for that is that we put everything in our Constitution, making it extremely difficult to change. And we'll get into that. But right now, when you read about somebody somewhere reducing the number of days their people can go to the polls, well, we're already there. We can only vote on one day. When those people restrict those days, those people are left with more days than we have now. And they frequently, in almost every case, have much more liberal absentee ballot laws. So this is the same information. So in Connecticut, we vote in person, in a polling place, on election day. And if you're out for the entire day in another state, you can ask for an absentee ballot, or if you're disabled. So the First Amendment to the Constitution of Connecticut said that general elections shall be held on the Tuesday after the first Monday of November. And that is literal. And that is what we're doing now. And this clause is why we don't have early voting. You have to be absent from the city or town, or because of sickness or physical disability, to get an absentee ballot. And we'll get into the statutory interpretation of this or implementation of this, which makes things even worse. So Article 12, I hate to read slides. I hate anybody to read slides to me, but you need 3/4 vote of the legislature, both chambers, 3/4 vote to get a constitutional amendment on the next general election ballot. If you don't get that 3/4 vote, if you just get a majority or more, then you have to wait until the next legislature convenes, that is after the next election. And that legislature also has to vote in favor of the constitutional amendment. And then you have to wait till the next general election in an even numbered year for the public to vote on the constitutional amendment and accept it. And we'll see how that all works out in terms of absentee balloting. So the goal this time around is to write amendments to the Constitution that are broad enough that the legislature can set the dates we can vote. The legislature can set what the absentee ballot rules are. The constitutional amendments are deliberately broad, some people would argue vague, so that the legislature can pass statutes that implement the Constitution. So the next time we have a pandemic for something, or something of that sort, we can just change the law as opposed to change the Constitution. So the early voting amendment we voted on 2 years ago, but we didn't get 75%. In fact, it was very funny watching the Republicans jockey around because they hadn't figured out in advance who could vote to get to 75%, who could vote for it, who had to vote against it. And so they were actually bouncing back and forth and doing the math to try to make sure that it didn't get 75%. So the House has voted for the early voting amendment, so we can vote days before the official election day. The Senate will vote on it. It will go to the voters in November of 2022. And if it's passed, the legislature could implement it for the election in November of 2023. So we just voted in the House on absentee voting, and that means no excuse. You can have absentee ballot for just asking for it. And we approved it, but it was less than 75% again. So what does this mean? If the Senate approves it this year, we could vote on it in the 2023 election. That means it would be, I'm sorry, if the Senate, go ahead.
I was just going to correct what you just said, but you were just about to correct yourself. Go ahead.
I was, but thank you. I appreciate that. Any error I make, feel free to correct. If the Senate approves the amendment this year, a new House and Senate can vote on it again in 2023. If both approve, the constitutional amendment will be on the ballot for the public in 2024, and the legislature could implement in 2025. So you see how long this process is. It can be 5, almost 6 years before you actually implement a constitutional amendment concerning voting. And since we already voted in the House and didn't get 75%, there is no chance that we'll have no excuse absentee balloting before the 2025 elections. This was the vote on the absentee ballot. Halfway down the 5th column, you'll see the name Ackert. That's the beginning of the Republicans. So you can see what the vote was. There is one other way to loosen up absentee balloting just a little bit earlier. Representative Blumenthal's, and this is Connecticut House Representative Blumenthal, as opposed to Senator Blumenthal, HB 6205. It turns out that our statutory implementation of the current constitutional rules concerning voting is more restrictive than it absolutely has to be. So his bill would change that implementation. It would delete during the hours of voting, and it would substitute on the day of. The effect of that would be if you were out of your district at any time during the day, you could ask for an absentee ballot. If you were missing from your district at any time during the day of the election, you could ask for an absentee ballot. He wouldn't have to be missing the entire hours of voting. Also, his bill would delete illness and substitute sickness. And the thought is that it doesn't have to be your personal illness. It could be a relative sickness, a friend's sickness, maybe even a societal sickness like a pandemic. These things would maybe be challenged and they would be interpreted by the courts. But those are the two things that might happen this session to loosen up absentee balloting a little and still stay within the Constitution. And that's it.
Okay, there. I just was kind of following up to put stuff in the chat there, following up what you were saying. So hi, I'm Carol Rizzolo. The introduction also spoke about the federal work that I do, but I'm one of the leads of Connecticut Shoreline Indivisible and the lead of the legislative action team for Shoreline Indivisible and Get Out the Vote, and also Safe Vote CT. So Safe Vote CT, a small handful of us organizers started last March, a year ago March, in order to be sure that people during the pandemic would be able to vote absentee without needing an excuse. It was like pulling teeth to get that onto the agenda. We did manage to get it. So for those of you who were able to vote absentee, just saying COVID, the Secretary of State and all these activist groups around the state really worked very hard to get that onto the agenda. So we were able to vote during the special session. Mike and his colleagues managed to push it through so that we were able to use, that any of us could use absentee balloting in August for the primary, and then it had to come up again to be voted on for November, along with drop boxes. All of that stuff theoretically went away in 2020, right? So we could do all that in 2020. Over 650,000 Connecticut residents used that, used absentee balloting as a way to vote. To Mike's point, the issue about are you sick or aren't you sick and whose illness is it actually was pretty pivotal in getting it to where we could say, listen, that is a real technicality, right? Am I sick, or is it that my mother, who's 99, who I take care of, is sick? Or do I live with somebody who I'm worried about getting sick? There was all of these shenanigans around that particular word, which is why what Mike was saying about Matt Blumenthal is that Matt's bill kind of shifts this definition to be a little bit broader, so that if I'm worried that someone in my family will be sick, I can use that as a reason to get an absentee ballot. It's kind of complicated. So there are a couple of things that I just wanted to pick up on that Mike had said. So like, why do we vote on Tuesdays anyway, right? The reason we vote on Tuesdays anyway is because in the original framers, the idea was everyone had to be able to go to church on Sunday. The farmers had to take all their farm goods to the farms to sell on Mondays, and then they needed to travel to the county seat. And they couldn't get to the county seat before Tuesday. So in I think it's 1816 is when the Connecticut Constitution was written. I'm in the right decade there. Nothing personal against any white men, but this was white male landowners who write the Constitution and really were quite intentional about who did they want to be able to vote, who couldn't vote, right? This was strictly wrapped around who would be able to take off on a Tuesday and go vote in person? Obviously, it's not going to be the laborers. It obviously didn't include people of color, and it didn't include women at that time, right? So I kind of want to speak to that. I mean, now that's obvious. Like, why is this stuff in the Constitution and not in statute? Statute would mean that the legislature could vote every 2 years. They could change it. Right. So the idea of just like what will be on the ballot now as far as early voting in 2022 will just say, do you want the legislature to decide how many days of early voting we should have? It's sort of one more time where actually those of us voters out here who would say, sure, we would vote for 5 days or 10 days or a number, but that's actually not what's going to be presented to us. The Constitution writers were very clear. They do not want us to have that decision to make. That should be under the legislature. How many days is right? What are all the different complications? I mean, at some level that makes sense. I mean, there are costs involved, right? Is the town clerk going to accept these ballots? Are there going to be open election polling places? So there are all these complications that the legislature would decide. So that may just complicated what you just said, Mike, but at the end of the day, we have two separate ballot initiatives happening here, right? HJ 59, which is the early voting amendment, that we did get passed, as Mike said, by simple majority last time, and got passed by simple majority in the House this time, but only in the State House. At this point, if it doesn't get passed in the State Senate also, we are, I think the technical phrase is shit out of luck as voters, because we actually won't, sorry, that's very technical, of course, but we won't have the opportunity to even consider even early voting anytime other than that one day, 14 hours, one and done, that's it. The three reasons you can get the absentee ballot: active duty military, as Mike said, out of town, or illness and for kind of chronic illness. The problem with that out of town thing is that imagine the student and have this person live in Hartford. He works, or she, it doesn't matter. This person, this voter, works in East Hartford and takes a class in West Hartford at UConn. And they drive through Hartford on the highway for 5 minutes on election day. That person legally cannot access an absentee ballot because they are indeed in the town where they vote during any of those 14 hours. So some of the restrictive language is you have to be in town any part of those 14 hours, right? So if this person leaves home at 6:05 and the polls opened at 6, legally that person can't apply for an absentee ballot. Now, do people do it? Sure. But as it turns out, it's illegal and carries a pretty hefty fine should it be found out. So the problem here with the House and the Senate. The House, as we kind of all know, and Mike knows certainly, you're electing somebody who you probably know, they have to live in the area. It's a fairly small number of people that they're representing. I mean, it's like 60, I'm sorry, it's about 15,000 people. Isn't that right? How many people are in your 12 or 15,000, sometimes 16,000.
16.
But 16. So it's essentially a majoritarian body. Okay, I mean, there are X number of representatives there. They all represent a fairly small group. Problem with the Senate, it is a non-majoritarian body. And it's what we're seeing in DC also, right? I mean, West Virginia does not have the same population as New York, but they have the same 2 senators that New York does. That was actually a well-arranged GOP thing originally, as to like, why are there 2 Dakotas? It makes no sense why there are 2 Dakotas, right? I mean, there aren't enough people in one of them to match what's in California or even in New York. But in order to increase the Republican representation in Senate, there's an artificial line drawn there. We have a North Dakota, we have a South Dakota, and they've got 4 senators between them. And California only has 2 senators, even though their population is dramatically more. New York, same, right? So the Senate is a non-majoritarian body. In Connecticut, we worked a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, the state Senate was 50-50. There were 18 Republicans, 18 Democrats. In state, all of us indivisible and resistance groups worked very hard to push that to where now the Senate is 16 to 12, 24-12, 24-12, right, in favor of the Democrats, which is much more reflective of the state. So why am I saying all of this? Because at the end of the day, we are in this incredible pickle where, to Mike's point, all of this different shenanigans of which Republicans would vote for early voting, would vote for absentee balloting. Why did they even get separated to start with? They got separated to start with because the Republicans said they refused to include absentee balloting 2 years ago in the early voting bill. They said they wouldn't vote for it. It got amended, and you know what? They didn't vote for it anyway. So it's just what we're seeing federally. We're seeing it here too. And the language of the GOP amendments for these 2 bills here in Connecticut for early voting and for absentee mirrors exactly the language we've been seeing roll out nationally. It's just the same. We want ID laws. Okay, we need voter ID laws. Well, let's talk about how one gets a photo ID. Have the person not be a student, and again, have them be a low-wage worker or an hourly worker who's busy with kids, with whatever. The only way to get a photo ID is to go to the DMV, which we all know is like really efficient, right? You can get a state ID. Let's say you're a non-driver. You can get a state ID, but it costs money and it takes time. And so these folks, and what's happened in Georgia that frankly the CT GOP was trying to get also, was, okay, so what's the problem with photo IDs? Well, there really is no problem. I mean, okay, fine. I mean, theoretically, that's great. So what Georgia said is if you want an absentee ballot, you've got to send in a copy of your photo ID. Well, that's great, but I don't know how many really lower wage workers or Alice families actually have a printer in their house, right? How in the hell are they going to make a copy of the thing and send it? And then in order to send in the ballot, they've got to make another copy and send it also. The Gwinnett County, just outside of Atlanta, the Gwinnett County clerk said to people, listen, anybody who wants this, you come here and I'll make a copy for you, because it's an obvious problem. And so anyway, so here in Connecticut, the GOP is reading from the same playbook. So to Mike's point, it is absolutely correct that we have actually some of the most restrictive voting laws in the nation. 1 day, 14 hours, one and done, that's it. So what can we do here in Connecticut? And then I'll obviously give back. I see there's a question there for Mike. The thing to do at the moment is if this bill, so HJ 59 is the early voting amendment. It needs to get called in the Senate. Senate President Pro Tem Marty Looney says he'll call it. He doesn't seem to have a problem with early voting. He's only got 2 weeks to call this damn thing. And if he doesn't call it, it dies in the water. So one is to call him. It doesn't matter if you're his constituent, because this is a statewide thing. Contact Marty Looney. You can find it. I can put his contact information in the chat. The other is this absentee balloting thing. We really worked very hard with postcarding, letter writing, texting, phone banking to try to get to 75% at the end of in the House. This is for HJ 58, absentee balloting. We didn't make it to 75%. We hit like 68%, but it needs to get called in the Senate, passed by simple majority again, so that in the next session, 2023, it can come up, it can get a simple majority, it can turn up on the ballot for 2024 for Connecticut voters to say, yes, actually, we do want absentee balloting. At that point, if it passes, which I would imagine it will, if it passes, the legislature decides in 2025 exactly what that would look like. And by 2026, we actually have it. So all of these efforts are about opening up, can Connecticut vote? And
Thank you.
There you go.
No, Carol, that's amazing. And, you know, I'm a former social studies teacher and a military veteran. So voting by absentee was the first way I voted when I was stationed in Germany. So, and I don't remember being asked about any ID. You just sent it into the town clerk and she sent me my ballot. So I think what we're gonna do now is let's like transition to what we wanna talk about for questions. We've got about 20 minutes. If we can put the questions in the chat box, people can figure out which ones they want to answer. And then, of course, there's always follow-up. So following up later after today, you know, we have Facebook pages that people can find us by. I know that Carol was mentioning earlier that she was going to provide her contact information. We know we can find Mike at CGA's, the General Assembly's website with his contact information. And, you know, it's just really important that we reach out to our friends and neighbors all over Connecticut who are in those Republican-held Senate seats. And, you know, when I worked for Congress, if you got 10 phone calls on the same subject, it was a groundswell. because holy cow, 10 people called in today. So if you have friends and neighbors, relatives that are in a Republican held seat here in Connecticut, get them to reach out to their state senator and state rep to make sure that they understand that people in their district want it, and they don't have to follow the party rules. So I'm gonna let's see, what have we got for questions? Carol put up her contact information. That's awesome. Now you need to take it down while the Zoom call is in effect, because when the call is done, when the workshop is over, this rolls right into the next workshop. And so you don't want to think that you can come back to it later. You may never find it again. So make sure if that is something that you want, that you are grabbing it. Carol.Rizzolo@gmail.com. Excellent, excellent.
Sherry, Mike has asked me a question. What are the odds? Yeah, the odds get better when all of the 19 people on this call, well, there are 3 of us or us, but even us. I mean, everybody's got to contact Looney and Duff. There is a good likelihood. Looney has publicly said he is totally in support of early voting. He's been very hedgy about absentee balloting. So the answer is that people need to call, they need to send an email. Contacting the local Republican at this point, they're not going to vote for it in the Senate. They might, but it doesn't matter because we've got a simple majority in the Senate anyway. So it really is going to be about contacting these 2 that I've just put up there and saying, call the vote.
Sherry, could I add one thing? If you live in May Flexer's district, she is the head of the Government Administration and Elections Committee, where this comes out of. So calling her would probably get you a pretty good reading on what's happening. And also she'll be able to tell people like Marty that people are calling her.
Right. The other thing is, in managing mail for elected officials, put it in the subject line. Like put the HJ58, HJ59 in the subject line, call the vote. You know, they don't need this big, long, wordy thing. It's literally a tally mark for and against. So don't think that you don't know what to put in the email or in the call. Just put your name and address and call the vote in the body, but definitely put it in the subject line.
And the same with a tweet or on. So Duff has a Twitter page. Looney's got a Facebook page. CT Senate Dems have a Twitter page. Just put it everywhere. And Sherry's exactly right. All you're putting is call the vote, HJ58 and HJ59. Can you believe that Connecticut won't be able to absentee ballot until 2026? What is up with that nonsense? So, you know, and Christopher Rivers, who comments about being on active duty, and Sherry commented too, you know, this is where we tip into, why does all of this matter? Why does the post office matter? Right? Because military ballots didn't arrive in time in a lot of the states to be counted in the presidential. So, House joint, HJ58. The J is joint. Isn't that right, Mike? Yeah, it's House joint. Were there any problems with the absentee? No, there were no damn problems, actually. Gail Mastrofrancesco, one of the Republican representatives, when they first talked about these drop boxes, talked about, what if people throw a Coke in them? Or what about if people throw a can in them? They're not secure, it'll ruin all the ballots. They are as secure or more secure than a postal box, and there were no problems. And in fact, S5, which is, is it SJ5? Might be SJ5, going through the Senate now in Connecticut, would make the drop boxes permanent. The problem at the moment is those drop boxes disappeared after 2020 until the governor, there's an extension of his emergency powers as far as elections to November 3rd, which keeps the drop boxes in place. But there are 2 towns, Vernon being one of them, I think, or maybe it was Putnam. One of them, basically, along with Wallingford, put the drop box in the basement. It was you guys? Yeah. You're muted, Mike.
We didn't put it in the basement. We didn't.
You had the drive-through, didn't you?
We didn't use it. We set up our own box.
Yeah, yours was the drive-through in the bank where you had to hand it through the window. That was pretty jive. So what he's talking about is as the voter, like everybody around here certainly knows, I'm a pretty lunatic Democrat activist. And this was, you drive through essentially a bank teller system that's got a camera on you where you hand your ballot to the person inside who says they are putting it in the drop box. But there's no way to know what that person on the inside did with it at all. It was unmute.
If I could,
Please prove me
you
wrong.
could walk up to it and put it in the slot, just like you were making a night deposit. If you were disabled, they had to come out and take the ballot from you and put it in for you.
Mike, who's the they? They were poll workers.
No, they were the town clerk's staff. My state senator, Dan Champagne, is also the mayor of Vernon. And he just decided that he wasn't going to use the state box.
It was paid for by federal money, right? So ultimately, after the election, when people like Dan Champagne and his pals and Wallingford too wanted to throw out the drop boxes, Denise Merrill sent out an email saying you can't throw them out, they're federal, paid for by federal money. So at the moment, the hope is that I think it's SJ5 will go through, which will make the drop boxes permanent. So the language changes in 6205. Mike, that's a question to you. Susan Zimmerman. Do you see it? Are the language changes in 6205 just subject to legislative approval? That's correct. There's no constitutional amendment there.
Correct. And Mr. Representative Blumenthal is an attorney, and he believes that his interpretation is within the current constitutional amendment. I will tell you something very strange happened, though. That bill came up for a vote and that bill was on the hot list to be voted on. And for some reason, it didn't come up, probably because that session went very long. And then the next day it was gone. So I do not know why we did not take up this bill the next day. I always say that Matt Ritter is a very nice guy, but he has the exact same powers as Mitch McConnell had.
That's right.
He decides what bills live or die by what bill he announces on the floor of the House. And for some reason, he took the bill, Representative Blumenthal's bill, off the agenda. And if he doesn't put it back on the agenda, it will not be voted on. So I do not honestly know what's going on. But I'm hopeful that the bill will be voted on later in the session.
But he is delightfully also subject to the same amount of pressure. So by all means, it doesn't matter if you're one of his constituents. You can write, I support 6205, call it for a vote. Because at this point, we're running out of time.
And in Matt's case, that's effective because his primary goal in life is to keep and expand the Democratic majority in the House. And while you write to some representatives, if you're not in their district, they don't care. Matt cares about all of them. Mm-hmm. So if he gets mail, he knows maybe that his seat is safe, but he also knows that if this reflects a general will, if he gets enough that he thinks it reflects a general will, then he's concerned about his members. So that does work on Matt, where it might not work on somebody who only cares about their own district.
Right. That's a great point. We have 10 minutes before I do the gentle hook. So we're at 9:35. I had one question I wrote down in the very beginning about sickness and the definition of sickness. So, if you wake up and you don't feel good,
you're out of luck.
Right. So how is that managed, and who has to authorize that you are entirely sick if you're going to claim that you're sick?
During COVID, there was a choice. During COVID, all the different town clerks had worked together that someone could come to the car and someone else could hand it. There were all these different ways during COVID. But again, all of that went away. So if you're sick that day, you really, there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing. Or if one of your kids is ill, or if you're in the emergency room. We had, I don't know how long that hearing went for, I think 24 hours, where we were at doing this legislative hearing saying, listen, we need to be able to do this. Here are the reasons. And it all involved illness either of self or of a loved one. So
Right.
there is nothing in the Connecticut Constitution that allows you to vote in any other way other than those three. And again, part of what happened was we were able to say illness, not the Constitution says illness or sickness, but a legislative add-on said his or her, meaning the voter. So without that add-on, you could get away with saying it was COVID as illness, not my illness, but
Right. I'm afraid of the illness. I'm afraid of exposure. So I'm going to stay home and
right.
still vote.
But that's a statutory add-on, his or her. That's not in the Constitution.
All
So
right.
Matt's is taking it back to, let's just call it what it is, illness, no matter whose it is.
And that's when if you are a caregiver of someone, if it's somebody in your family is sick and you are the caregiver in your home, then.
Or vulnerable.
I just think it's very interesting that we don't hold our military members to the same standard. I know that Christopher Rivers said he was on active duty as well. Like, no one ever asked me for my ID. I just mailed it in from Germany and they mailed me the ballot. And, I was so uneducated. I don't even know if I mailed it in enough time to get back to Brooklyn using the APO. So I think that, one of our other conversations later today, our workshop, is going to be about our bias. And so maybe right here, this speaks volumes that we think that, some people can be trustworthy with requesting a ballot without ID, and others for some reason are less than it's really.
But Sherry, it's really, fraud is almost non-existent. I mean, it's a felony offense with a 20-year prison sentence to go add another vote for your dead mother. I mean, like that guy, right? So it's just not, it's never been an issue. And that's why, claiming fraud in voting hasn't been an issue. And I mean, it just doesn't happen. And here it's very low. I mean, there are several other reasons to kind of want to address things with voting here that are kind of secondary, right? Like if I send in my ballot and I didn't put it in that other envelope, right? I didn't put it in the privacy envelope, it doesn't get counted, but there's no way for me to be told that. There's no ballot curing is what it's called. Even Georgia can cure ballots, right? They send it, it bounces back for some reason. They hear about it, they know about it. It's online that it didn't get counted and they can fix it. We can't. We never know it was wrong. So if I, for 10 years, have sent in an absentee ballot, not signing one of the things like that inner envelope, it just doesn't get counted, but I never get told I screwed it up. Our voting systems in Connecticut really, really need a lot of work, but fraud is not a problem.
Well, and maybe using our educational system, we have an amazing educational system in Connecticut, and maybe Mike, something that needs to be addressed is how do we foster a good voting record and good voting habits is to be educated in how to do that. Kind of like, how do you balance a checkbook, with financial literacy. Maybe voting literacy actually needs to be added to the potato famine and the other 10 things that must be taught in Connecticut schools. So,
climate change couldn't make it into what needs to be taught in Connecticut schools. Got 169 towns and each one decides their own curriculum. State can only suggest it.
Encouraging people to study social studies and encouraging people to vote is obviously a Democratic plot.
Clearly, right? But Sherry, to your point, a lot of what Safe Vote CT is doing and Make Voting Easy, we really have a lot of activist groups around the state who are doing exactly that. It's really about voter education. And once people now in Connecticut have used absentee ballots, they're going to be really pissed when these things get pulled.
Well, and it could be a very local issue. This is where our Board of Ed members and Board of Ed elections really do matter, is that maybe town by town, we need to pick off and insert great policy that classes are going to be offered. Every year, just like health class, sex ed now goes from pre-K all the way to 12th grade, and it's based on, what's age appropriate. So maybe boards of ed across Connecticut are where we take this fight to when we have local municipal elections, and we think that, at least in Brooklyn, finding candidates to run is tricky. And actually having where somebody loses is tricky as well. And maybe this could be an issue that we take locally to the voters, and town by town, we pick away at voter education or social studies.
So Secretary of State's doing that bill I was just mentioning, SJ5, will be automatic voter registration anytime somebody touches a state agency, right? So like the Department of Motor Vehicles has that, but all of the other different state agencies might. You think that's got a great chance of passing, huh? Is that what? Who knows?
I'm smiling because we once did it at the Department of Social Services, except there was a minor scandal when it turned out that thousands of them were laying in an office somewhere, never having been sent to the people at, at the town clerk's office. So I think there's a good chance it'll pass. I will confess, though, that senators don't usually talk to House members, and they have a culture up there that we don't understand.
Right, right. It's non-majoritarian. It's quite striking. And
perhaps ones that started in the House might be the weak link that you could cozy back up to your fellow membership and see about, there's nothing I find a Bud Light can't fix. So,
it's really about making noise. In truth, I mean, part of the reason we were able to absentee ballot is because we sent about 15,000 postcards. There were weekly phone banks into the Republican and Republic. It was Democrat and unaffiliated voters who had applied for absentee ballots in Connecticut who lived in red districts, right? So it was phone banks. We sent 162,000 texts to say, contact your reps. I mean, this really was a major statewide effort. So again, anybody who's interested in the grassroots work that we're doing in Connecticut, of which there is a ton, please reach out and contact me. And I'm more than happy to get you plugged into the stuff that's going on. Really, it is truly statewide, because this is ridiculous that we have to fight for this. Anyway.
Exactly. For those of you that can see the screen, it's just her first name dot last name. For those of you who are on the call, Carol, CAROL dot RIZZOLO at, is it Gmail? I wrote it down.
Email.
At Gmail, right? So it really does matter. Every moment matters. And right now it looks like we're at the crossroads. Like you said, we have 2 weeks to get stuff called. Just call and let people vote on it. Just call the vote and let's see what we can do.
And tell 5 friends. Sorry, but send a text.
Exactly.
To friends that
I mean,
says,
this is literally DTC work. This is, your DTC and your neighbor and your family and friends. Exactly. And I see Alyssa Ahrens is on, one of our young voters here in Brooklyn, who I've watched blossom from a little tiny girl in the pew at church to a grown woman who is just amazing. So, getting our high schoolers to care about it, getting those 18 to 25-year-olds that are busy and are not maybe as engaged as we wish. All right, so that's the 9:45 gentle alarm. Who has a burning desire? Who wants to ask a question? Who's got something in the chat box? What have we got? Nada. All right. Well, I think that we have an amazing day planned for the rest of our workshops. I think that this morning's workshop gives us a taste of the work that's still before us that needs to be done. I know that people that sign on to these workshops are the grassroots, Energizer bunnies of each and every town. I saw Susan Zimmerman on here. I haven't seen her in person in feels like a decade, but good to see you. For those of you who can make calls later today while you're feeling that time is now, time is of the essence. Get those emails out today with the subject line, call the vote.
Call the vote. Put it up on your Facebook pages. If you have Facebook pages, put it there. Get everybody to email to both of those two saying call the vote. If you've got a Twitter account, if you're on Instagram, they're all over these things. So it is really make noise to get this done. And 6205, I mean, that's really this question too, is where did Matt's bill go? That's the one that's to contact Matt Ritter, say call the vote. And yeah, they're special.
Exactly. And this is where democracy wins when we participate, right? This is where we all talk about our veterans and our soldiers that are overseas and people that we care about that fought for democracy. Well, this is how we honor that commitment, that everybody gets the vote, even if you're homesick, even if you're out of town, even if you just, let's talk about mental health awareness, right? You just can't leave the house.
That's
If
right.
nobody needs to sign off on that, if you don't need a doctor's note for that, it shouldn't be that hard. We should be able to vote every single time. Thank you. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for attending. The rest of the morning is going to be amazing. And then at the 12:15 mark, I know we have Congressman Jim Himes. That is going to be some good stuff on cybersecurity. And then U.S. Senator Chris Murphy later today, who served in all the chambers. And so if you want to talk about, going from state rep to state senator to congressman to U.S. senator, maybe picking his brain on how to get something done for those of you that have access to the senator afterwards. It's really going to take calling everybody you can to get this done.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm really proud of us. We did it on time. If you need something in the chat box, grab it now before Joe turns off or we switch over to the next thing. Everyone did a great job. And I can't wait till we can do this in person in 2 years. All right.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Joe.
All right,
Thank you, everybody.
I'm going to put everybody back into the waiting room. That said, if you have the next session is in this channel, feel free to hang tight, but we're going to just have you in the waiting room until about 10 a.m. If you have to switch channels, go to your email. It should be right at the top of your inbox, and switch to the channel for your next session at approximately 10 a.m.